Well, and welcome to the second part of our 2022 Pride Forum. For those of you that don't know, my name is Dr. Dwayne Wright. I'm an assistant professor of higher education administration, as well as I have the honor and privilege of serving as the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives here at the Graduate School of Education and Human Development, which of course is part of GW. This is the second part of our Pride Forum, and as was expressed in last week's lunchtime event, we are here to celebrate the month of Pride. Pride comes from the anniversary of a riot, a protest, the Stonewall riots. In fact, the anniversary was yesterday, 6/28 is known as Stonewall Day. Last week, we had the privilege and honor of learning from some young DI participants. But this week, what we have for you is, if I could be so bold, the main event. We have Dr. Melissa Kim, who has the honor and privilege of serving as the Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools. I am going to introduce Dr. Kim in a minute. And as has been our practice here for our Pride Forums, I'll give her an opportunity to introduce herself, because I know for a fact, without even talking to her about it, the bio does not do this marvelous and remarkable woman justice. Before we go there, a few housekeeping notes. We do have both a chat function and a Q&A. I know several of you might be attending and want to ask questions of our guest. You can do that via the chat function or the Q&A. Please know that on the chat function, it actually continues to gather both your questions and your thoughts. So when we get to about the 4:55, 5 o'clock hour, and I go back to the questions, if you put it in the chat, I might lose it. So if you know you've got to dip off or you really want to get it answered, I suggest putting it in the Q&A. We are recording today, folks, but we will stop that recording for the audience Q&A. A word before we move on about the Q&A today. We know that we are living through a whirlwind. In fact, in just the 7 days since our last Pride event, we've seen the rollback of the qualified right for abortion. We've seen at least 2 or 3 cases involving religion in schools that some might see questionable. And I haven't even got to the most important thing that happened. Beyonce released a new single. No, seriously, folks, we're having a lot going on, including over 700 pages of Title IX regulations, which a lot of people forget apply to K through 12 schools as well. While Dr. Kim is here representing DC Public Schools, there's just simply no way that she can get to all those moving parts, some of which she and her team haven't really had a chance to digest yet. So if you could keep your questions to the focus of the event, which are equity and our LGBT students, Dr. Wright would really appreciate it. We're of course not going to mandate that. It's something simply that I'm asking you to do. Finally, here at GW, we are here to learn from each other respectfully and respectfully disagree if need be. However, we have no tolerance for disruption or for rude behavior. If that was your purpose today, I would go ahead and leave right now. And if you do that, unfortunately, we're going to have to remove you. We've never had to do that. I hope to never have to do that. But since we have a public figure here today, I just wanted to go and put that out there. All right. So with the housekeeping done, let me read Dr. Kim's bio, and I will read it because it is exceptional. Dr. Melissa Kim is the Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools. In this role, she leads the district's 116 schools, wow, as well as all the program, including academics, interventions, innovations, equity initiatives, and family engagement to ensure that DC Public Schools provides a rich and rigorous experience for all students. Dr. Kim has been an educator in DC for more than 20 years, and she previously served as a chief academic officer for KIPP DC, where she worked closely with secondary schools and special ed services to ensure student success. Prior to that, Dr. Kim worked as a partner at the New Schools Venture Fund and the principal of the Dell Middle School. Dr. Kim grew up in Yardley, Pennsylvania, please correct me if I said that wrong, and obtained a bachelor's from Colby College, a Master of Arts from Trinity College, and a doctorate of education from the Ivy League school, the University of Pennsylvania. We are astounded. We are so proud, and we are so thankful that you have decided to join us for this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, the Deputy Chancellor of DC Public Schools, Dr. Melissa Kim. So first question, what did the bio not capture? Anything else you want to tell us? Anything else we
Oh,
should know
Dr.
about?
Wright. First of all, I'm finding this to be so much fun already. You have such a lovely way of like setting the table and being super engaging through the screen. If I could capture what you're doing right now and like teach it to so many other people, I think that'd be great. So I really appreciate you and how you're engaging us and me right now. I think the bio covered all the professional big hits. I think what it doesn't capture is, this is actually my 25th year in DC, working and supporting children in their development. And just thinking that, one of the questions you guys asked me to think about was, what is it that you want future teachers to know? And actually, it's in your title. It's in the title of George Washington. Like there was a time when I was a teacher 25 years ago, I really thought teaching kids how to read, write, do math, and engage with one another was enough. And that content, that if they mastered the fourth grade content or fifth grade content, that was a success for them and for me. 25 years later, after I've had the privilege of teaching them, and now that they're the parents of the students that we teach now in schools, I think redefining educators as not only content experts, but human development experts is, I think, the thing that lovely bio doesn't capture. The spirit of what we're trying to do in DC public schools with teacher preparation and leadership preparation and just the setting of the table, the way you have done starting this conversation, just be welcoming of everyone to the school, where we're really thinking about the ages and stages of our kids, and thinking about that is what that bio doesn't quite capture, that I'm really excited to talk about today, particularly through the lens of pride, but certainly for all students. Yeah, and I can keep on talking more, but I'm happy to stop there. And
oh no, this is a back and forth conversation, and you are our guest of honor, so please feel free to lecture, ramble, choose the best word you want. We're here to learn from you. Dr. Kim, I'm going to ask you this, and I'm going to violate a rule that was taught to me in law school. I'm going to ask a leading question. I am not going to ask if you fell in love with teaching. I can tell from your job right now, the jobs that you have, that at one point you fell in love with teaching. You fell in love with educating. How did that process come about? Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that? Because someone as remarkable and as talented as you could have probably done anything she wanted to do in the world. Why teaching?
Well, that was actually the plan. I'm embarrassed to say that when I first came to DC to teach, I thought I was going to teach for 3 years, maybe 4 tops, and then go off to law school, actually, because, as an immigrant to this country, I just didn't know that, the way we define success for me when I was growing up as a language minority and certainly a student of color that didn't quite fit in. One of the ways I thought we got to success was to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I didn't really know or think about very much else. And I'm not good with body fluids of any sort. So we ruled that out pretty quickly. But I did love to read and argue and think about different perspectives of a question or thought. So I thought law school was to be the thing that like pulled my heart. But what kept me here is that like our students were so like, I don't, for those of you who joined from other places, I know your children in other cities and other places are super special, but something about the DC kid and what he or she or them at this point represents really struck a chord with me. The vibrancy of the personalities and their deep family and community roots. So it's not even, if I had to answer that question, it wasn't even like just the act of teaching and learning. It was actually the act of community building, and how I got to really become embedded into this community that I was a teacher at. And, we're talking about in the 90s where they're closing down and shutting down housing projects, actually, where my students were living. And our school was in this middle of this community. It's surrounded by 3 different housing projects, of which I think lots of people would have said it was a scary place, a place of violence. I didn't see it that way. My students certainly didn't see it that way. They saw it as a place of community, strong relationships, where they saw not only their parents, but their neighbors, because they were so close by. And to see all of that then get destroyed in many ways, and working with our students and their families to actually do all the many paperwork steps to find new housing somewhere else with different promises. I think what kept me in DC was actually just the relationships, and feeling like many of our students now, unfortunately to say, but certainly growing up, I never felt like I quite belonged or I was included in community. Just because language minority different, back then in the 90s, obviously racism felt differently. It's very, very explicit. Today it's a lot more hidden in some cases, although there's lots of examples where it's not. And I felt a strong connection to our community at that time. So that's what, had me stay. That's what got me hooked every single year. And really just after 25 years, it's amazing what kind of deep relationships you build and what things keep you fulfilled.
Yeah. As someone who is a recent transplant to DC, I can definitely retweet that the community here is really remarkable, through adversity, through triumph, through World Series wins and World losses. It definitely sticks together, and it feels, a lot like down south, a lot like the Caribbean where I come from, very homey, very homey.
Yeah.
So folks, I know some of you are thinking, well, this is supposed to be a Pride event. Where are the Pride questions? We're getting to those. Please, Dr. Wright will not disappoint you. But since we have Dr. Kim here, I just wanted to dive very briefly in a few opening questions into just her background and now particularly the job. So, DC public schools, New York public schools, everyone knows has probably a chancellor either appointed by the mayor or some other form or fashion. Our chancellor in DC public schools is actually a GW graduate,
Yep.
Believe it or not. But what does, Dr. Kim, the deputy chancellor do? Describe the day if there is a normal day in your life.
Oh, Dr. Wright, that's an interesting question. That's a very good question. I should have a really strong answer to that. I don't. We have 116 schools and 116 leaders doing amazing things for students and communities during that time. So if I had to boil down my role, I try to remove as many barriers I can to get them to be the very best versions of themselves, so that they could create stronger, more vibrant communities. And that looks like helping with our budget structure to make sure that our school leaders have great ideas on how to spend their dollars to get the very best kind of resources in terms of talent and teachers, partnerships and supports in their programs. It could look like dreaming up of new exciting things that might happen in our future, staying about 3 to 5 years out of what we're currently doing. So one of the biggest, most exciting things we did for the last several years is getting to respond to how to redesign our high school experiences for our students. Cities across the country are told every year, pre-pandemic, that you are a pervasively, constantly failing school. And certainly in DC, we have some schools that fit in that space. And and I know, and many of the people on this call knows, it's structural systems that create conditions for schools to succeed or not. And so instead of thinking about those failing schools as places without talent or without great ideas, we flipped the paradigm and actually engaged with those 2 school communities. Thousands of conversations had with parents and teachers and students directly to have them redesign what they would have to put in place for that school to really churn that around in different ways that hopefully is lasting over years. And by that work, those 2 schools are stronger today. They have stronger enrollment. They have stronger 9th grade as well as graduation rates. And certainly they took some hits with the pandemic, but so much stronger than they were, 4 years ago. And because of their success, not led by me, certainly by the students and the teachers and the leaders there, they made such a proof point that we were able to gather a lot of national attention, where XQ, National Philanthropic Organization, has partnered with us to redesign now every one of our high schools with our students and communities in mind, and really elevating student voice. So I think my job is to take what others see as like a problem or a issue. And I think if done well, at my best, I'm able to flip that deficit thinking into a positive asset frame so that we create strength and leadership and possibilities where people are elevated versus allowing the same sort of patterns of negativity and blame to continue. So I think that's basically what I would say I do. And that it plays out in different ways. I can give lots of other examples, but our people definitely need buffering and protective layers so that they can become strong and stronger. And it boiled down, I'm the person that tries to create as many layers around great ideas and great practices in our kids as possible.
Wow, it's remarkable. First of all, it sounds like a very complicated job. So even though I live in Silver Spring, my heart's in DC, so thank you, because clearly we wouldn't be doing whatever we're doing without you. And what you said a lot of sort of, how you say, graham crackers for me. Reminded me a lot of the work of my friend Joshua Glazer, who is here. And then your leadership style, which is really human first, reminds me of Julia Stolberg Walker, who's the chair of our HOL, which is Human and Organizational Learning Department, who is also on the call. So, I'm sure you'll be getting an email from one or both of those folks trying to get you into a class or two, because everything you just said was fantastic. All right, let's get to the meat and potatoes, if you don't mind, and we'll start at the general level. What does DC Public Schools do? You don't have to list everything, but just general, to ensure that all students are treated equitably and that historic discrimination is taken into place. So, there's equality and then there's equity, and equity takes into consideration that which was denied in the past. Describe for us, if you can, in a nutshell, what DC Public Schools tries to do for all the students.
Yeah, I think we are far from getting to, if there is a promised land, of actually getting there. But I think some of our biggest steps is us actually acknowledging it and saying that we have what we do to recreate and replicate the patterns of oppression where it falls with racial lines as well as color lines and economic lines, is that thing that without tending to will replicate. So we're stating that. And now we're saying we want to stick a big, strong rod in those gears that will continue on. And we're going to try to break that. We're trying to break that while recreating it. And so thus, in many ways, we're saying that it is messy. It is going to be a long journey. We're calling it our process of becoming the promise that public education should be. And that journey and that process of becoming something different than what currently we're created to do. I think, in so many different facets, and there's no one answer to it all, because you have to stand from that perspective and address every single one. But our willingness to publicly speak the fact that we want to be an organization that actually delivers on the promise of public education for kids, which we currently own that it isn't doing. And that in order to do that, we want to recreate our functions and systems to become an organization that is growing a whole child holistically. Not only their academic selves, but their social emotional selves, the creative sides, the artistic sides, their physical well-being, obviously. And we can't do any of that without really putting their identity building at the center of all of that learning. And that identity, certainly in America, we cannot discuss without race at the core for sure. But every other intersectional identity, certainly sexuality being one, are areas that we're willing to address and say we cannot make those conversations hidden or shameful conversation for our children anymore, because every one of those things that are not positively framed, I think our students receive it as negative. There's no neutral when we're talking about identity. We need to affirm it. And so that is what we're doing. And that looks like we started a anti-racist university. This is our second year of that, where we're inviting every single teacher in our organization, as well as every single central office person, to say, let's come together and let's get smarter about how we think about our intersection of race. And one of the keynotes we had invited was Roxanne Gay, particularly to talk about the intersection of race and sexuality and sexual identity, because we're just not fluent at talking about this in public education. Actually, I don't think we're fluent around the country, and more practice that we have at it. I like to try to role model. I'm not sure I'm the very best at discussing all of this yet, but I want to make myself vulnerable and have all of the, 7,000, 9,000 members of DCPS adults hear me try it out, so they feel safer to try it out. And we want to get them the best in class sort of like supports along the way. So that is that. And certainly we're trying to make sure that that's at the teacher level. And there's lots of other like trainings and conferences and other sort of supports, but directly to the student level. This is for us our 10th year of hosting Leading with Pride Month, where we try to create a community for our students who are often so alone and feel like what they're experiencing is very insularly different for them and just super isolating. So we try to make it normal, right? We try to make it as an annual event where we bring kids together from across all of our schools, across all the different wards, and start building on the community. It's got workshops, students talking to students. We bring in guest speakers just to kind of keep that going. And obviously that is at a citywide sort of like system level. Most of all of our secondary schools have school specific clubs that we try to support with great teacher-based faculty. And there's much more we can do, but I think trying to see this, again, Dr. Wright, I don't know about your experience, but like there's so much I felt as a student growing up in an American school where I felt like I had to hide identities, different parts of who I was, because it just wasn't going to, be okay. And that vulnerability was nothing I could ever, I don't think I, until recently as an adult, figured out that I don't want to replicate that, right? So we're trying to create so many other opportunities, and maybe they're not enough, maybe it's too many, I don't know, but having every single adult try to do better for this group of kids than we got ourselves is, we're hoping, like, probably not the answer, but certainly a good strong step in creating the systems and structures and the new gears that we're systematizing, so our kids feel like they belong and they feel like never too far away from people who care about them, both adults and peers, and that there's somebody that they can talk about tough and complex issues of life with when it's their moment to discuss it.
No, there was so much there, so much. Folks, I have about 99 follow-ups, but I'm going to stay on script because I want to get to the point where you can ask your questions. I'll just remind you that you can use the chat function or the Q&A to put your questions in for Dr. Kim. Two things, Dr. Kim, that you said that resonate with me. One, sense of belonging. And, really starting early with that. You can't just wait to college, because if you wait till college, that's the guy who's getting in there, or gal, and, dropping out because they don't have that sense of belonging. So sense of belonging in a K through 12, really P through 12, P through 16 system. But then you said, there is no neutral. And I love that so much, that, that there is no, we've got to make a decision. We've got to go one way or the other. And not doing something is doing something, and letting the students know that if nothing else, we're here for you. It might not be perfect, it might not be necessarily everything that you need, hell, it might be 5 years too late for some students, but we're here for you. And I just love that, and I love that statement. Let's talk now specifically, if we can, about our LGBTQ students. We'll keep it into DC for now, but specifically our trans students, not in DC, but in some places, trans students, trans parents have been under attack. For those of you who cannot see in the mirror image, the button on my right says Trans Lives Matter. So Dr. Kim, here's the question. What does DC Public Schools do for LGBTQ students in general and specifically? And do we do anything for trans students, students that may be questioning, maybe non-binary, or during the process of middle school and high school come out as trans?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the areas that what I'll say is we need to do more. And obviously our trans students or students in the process of figuring all of that out and landing it, it's a journey for them, many of them as well, is obviously they have all the protections that our great city has put in place for trans students and trans folks. The issue is though, is this, I'll just make myself vulnerable. I don't know that I know enough of what they might need, because it is so individual, to figure out what is important to them. So I know like roughly things like based on what our student surveys, 3% of our student population says that they are trans. And they say they're the group of students for our district that scores the lowest in sense of belonging, right? They say that they're the most disconnected from our schools, and that cuts through all racial lines, right? They score lower than every other subgroup. And so they are telling us through our survey that we do twice a year, it used to be once a year pre-COVID, but now we do it twice a year, that it's not working for them. What I know is that what is in place isn't enough. They do feel more disconnected and more unsupported. They feel like they're not getting the support, not only from the adults, but also the peers. And it just, and I'm not a scholar of this particular topic, but it makes sense to me as a human member of our community. Like in our society, trans humans do not get a lot of love, attention, supports. It's one of the toughest identities to discuss, and the intersection of that with race, as well as potential, other things like language minority or just how you do is really tough. I have a personal, a child that's, of one of my friends who's going through this experience now as a very young little person. And she says, the school's been amazing. They've actually are the ones that are trying to figure out the pronouns with the student. And like, they ask my kid all the time, what does this work for you? Is there something about what's happening in school that's making you feel not great that we should know about? Because we're all here to support you. But that is this one case, and this very vocal student who feels very comfortable and supported at home to have these discussions. And I think for every one of these cases, I think there are probably dozens more where that open space to have the discussion and the homeschool partnership to say, hey, we'd like to have a conversation about what's going on at school and how that intersects with their gender identity and how that intersects with you as a student interacting with adults, as well as you students as a student interacting with peers, because those are all dynamics in the social milieu around that student. And I don't think that I have done enough to pull up from those very deep individual stories, patterns that we can name to call out supports and or structures to be paying attention to what is recurring and expected, and how can I support that population of student better. So yeah, that's all to say, like, all the legal stuff that students would get, like access to locker room spaces and bathrooms and the safe spaces to have conversations, all that absolutely in place. And I know it's not enough, and this is an area where we just need to do a lot more conversation. And maybe a couple other things we have done is several years ago, this is before my time back at DCPS, there was a huge effort to make sure that there are spaces for males of color and females of color to talk about, well, what is it like to be you in our school system, and how can we create more elevated space for males of color and females of color to be elevated and have greater voice and influence and just, strength of power, right? Well, those two things exclude a bunch of other kids who don't quite identify as male or female. So I think that's another example of how what we tried to do several years ago, that today we're recognizing is a gap. So we're taking some steps to say, even when we have those gender named groups happening, because those are important too, how do we create space for others to join without being exclusive? And should we be creating another group specifically to include others? And so we have, we created a task force around that, including city agency partners, educators, leaders, certainly, has not yet included students. And we're thinking next year that we are ready to get to the place where, we're back in person, things are happening. We need to bring students to the table to have them be part of that task force to help us tell us from their stories what should be in place that would help really move those numbers from that 3% of students telling us we're not getting it right.
No, I love the vulnerability and acknowledging that even in all the efforts. Now you went on for about 5-8 minutes, so you're doing a lot.
Gosh, please feel cut me off whenever.
No, never that. But you're doing a lot, but then still acknowledging that there's still more that needs to be done. And you're right. I don't know if there'll ever be an endpoint, but I definitely do appreciate the outlining of the initiatives and, trying to get to the students. And we've got a question when we get to the questions about that. Let me ask you this, moving a little bit away from DC. We've seen throughout our country now all types of legislation being passed. The infamous Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. In Texas, apparently, they're now investigating the parents of trans children for child abuse. All that is very political. Here at GSEHD, however, we're a research institution, and part of research is taking best practices and taking it to other places that can use it. So here's my question for you. DC is a hotbed of politics, but it seems that you and DC public schools have been able to roll out across the board equity initiatives for LGBTQ students and others and stay out of the political fray, right? Even though you're an entity of a city whose budget is controlled by Congress. Mm-hmm. Any advice for other chancellors, other deputy chancellors, principals in places that aren't DC on how to continue to institute equity initiatives without getting caught up in the critical race theory scare or getting fired because you've mentioned that you're married to someone who may not necessarily be the same sex? Any advice, best practices that people can take away? I mean,
I think my best advice, Dr. Wright, is not advice at all, is like, you got to go vote and be like super loud, because I think one of the reasons I certainly stick with DC is for the community we talked about in the very beginning of the conversation. But like, I love the fact that we are nested in a city where policies and political leaders really believe the inclusive nature of all humans being humans. And certainly one's sexuality who one loves is not something that should be used to exclude in any sort of conversation, right? So like, I think, in 2015, I want to say, I'm trying to look at my notes, there was like a bill that was passed, Amendment Act that was passed to say like every healthcare professional needs to take a training course on how to take care of the needs of LGBTQ patients and their families. That speaks a lot, right? Like, you don't want to get into a place where you're thinking about your own healthcare and you feel like you can't go see a doctor, go to a hospital, get treatment done or whatever, because of the fact that the subtle, bold, or subtle or quiet ways that you are not treated well, right? Like, that's not acceptable. And this particular act said every single person in healthcare will get this training, right? And I think part of what we were thinking about as a school district is well, maybe teachers need this kind of training. Like, how do we make sure that by having legislation and policies inform practice, because those two are super connected, that we create more protective layers around students who might be excluded or families that are excluded or pushed to the side. And I think the intersection of both policy and practice and who keeps an eye on that and how loud we are to make sure that, you know, even with all the national stuff going on right now that you opened with, like, we can't stand for that here, right? Like, you know, the fact that anybody has to go to a different state to have a medical procedure is ludicrous. And I hope that we do all that we can do with our loud voices, if we, you know, to ensure that people don't have to choose and continue to systematically hide parts of their core being, and not be then, you know, supported in our society. That is taking too many steps back. And I think that's part of what is beautiful about DC. And I think for the other cities and our states who don't have that, I mean, are you talking loudly enough? Are you gathering all of your people? Like, this is a picture from our Pride parade that brought families and teachers and students together to say, we support. We might not be of this particular affinity group, but man, we're supports. Like, there's no way that we're excluding anybody and or having anyone feel any less human based on inequality. And you know, I really encourage all of our community members to, like, you know, keep on pushing for it, and let's not take it for granted. I mean, you know, let's not take that for granted, because, you know, like all of us are talking about now, I mean, what else is going to go away? What else will be taken away? And I think that's very scary times for our students right now, who, you know, whether if you're a female student or a gay student, LGBTQ student, who knows what the next 5 years will bring. And Dr. Wright, I really appreciate the fact that you started by saying you're a Black gay man, gets to do what you have deep passions for, and you get to speak your mind and opinion. And that is probably really good for your physical health as well as your total health. And I think our students deserve that too.
No, amen. Amen to that. I think our students deserve a lot more than our politicians are giving them right now. So I think that's very good advice. You said something there. You said, you know, the bridge between policy and practice, right? And at GSEHD, we're all about that. Our dean, Michael Foyer, who is maybe not on right now, made part of his mission to bring sort of policy and practice initiatives to here when he became dean about a decade ago. So now I want to ask you to put on your critique hat a little bit. Mm-hmm. You're a deputy chancellor of a very large school district, not the largest, you've got New York and LA, but large enough. I'm going to ask you this, and then I've got a follow-up. What should education schools be doing now that we're not? You've hired teachers, you've supervised principals. You can just critique GSEHD if you feel uncomfortable critiquing anywhere else. What are we doing well? What could we be doing better to prepare principals, prepare teachers to go out and work for a school system like DC Public Schools?
Yeah, I mean, I led with this, Dr. Wright, because I think this is the core of where I think education needs to go. I think the identity of educator as not only content experts, but human development experts, and that it is your job, and you get excited to make sure the ages and stages, brain development, you know, of a little person's life that's very different from 3-year-old to 5th graders to 17-year-olds, and that you become as fluent and expert in that so that you can use that, what is predictable and recurring around the human development process and brain development process, to the content that you love and you are expert in, and marry it together so that the experience of the student is strengthened by the teacher's expert knowledge of both, I think is what I think schools of ed have not all yet embraced. Now, from your organization's title, it sounds like you're putting human development squarely, you're calling it out, right? This is not a school of education, this is not a school of leadership. This is actually learning connected to school human development, which is what I think many people sometimes forget about this business of teaching and learning and growing young people, is that there's a field of research out there about how that should be informing how a teacher enters the classroom and or the school community. And I don't think we do that a good enough job of integrating that. And then maybe the next thing, again, connected to human development, is something I feel like I didn't know as a young 20-some-year-old teacher that I feel like I'm knowing a little bit better now, but probably have a lot more to go, is around like the science of learning and development. Like the teaching or being a system leader or a building principal, like what is predictable and recurring is that you're going to find many examples of stress and where things don't go your way, and no matter what you've done to prepare for it and how smart you are, it's just not going to go the way you think it's going to go. And for the classroom teacher, that sometimes is about students and their learning, right? Like it's not going to go where that goes. And then we have a moment. We can either then blame ourselves, which is what I think young teachers do, right? Like we're like, okay, I can do this better, I can do this better, I can do this better. What I've found is that initial, I'm going to do XYZ differently better. After a certain point, maybe the 7th time you tried or 8th time you tried, you're like, because we believe so much in the efficacy ourselves, it's not a me problem. It's not because of me and what I did that this kid is really struggling with this. It must be then the kid, right? So at some point, there's a moment when every teacher faces like something isn't working. I've tried my best. It can't be me. And then it goes to the student. And I really think that's the place where I'd love to insert some pause and say, actually, it's probably not you alone. It's definitely not the student. What's happening in the context, larger context of the classroom and or school or communities that's not working? And can we see patterns in that? And then can we like together figure out a pathway that doesn't end up problematizing that kid? Because that then gets imprinted in their identity as, successful, or someone that my teacher that, I care about a lot thinks I'm like a bit of a failure. And that then I think creates this education learning journey where that kid has to carry that, which he or she or them is not deserving of, right? There's like a whole bunch of stuff that often gets put on that young identity of a learner that's growing that I think we as an organization or institution misplace. And I think we need to potentially think about practices and policies and the science behind that to get our educators prepare for that moment. Have them wrestle with what will you do? What will you do and how will you respond? What is a story of yourself that you say at that moment? What is a story of the students you tell at that moment? And what is a story that then gets spread as you talk to other educators and how you problem solve and or what's the story of that kid you talk to the parent about? And I think along those lines, a lot it's weighty, as you know, around race, intersectional race. What stories do Black kids get told versus what stories white kids get told? What stories do get like sexually mainstream gets told versus sexually questioning kids get told, right? I think all of those things are what I don't think we do a good enough job preparing our educators for, because they are the community builders and creators of what is good or not good, what is affirmed or not in that classroom dynamic space. And that's powerful. And I don't know that I certainly don't feel like I got that understanding as a teacher. I don't think I'm doing a great job yet figuring that out for the organization. And I don't think higher ed teacher prep organizations and or leader prep organizations are quite getting that either.
Wow. Well, let me just say, I am so glad that we're recording this because you just laid down the gospel. I was trying to follow, but I got to go back and take some notes and go back and read a little bit and take some notes because Dr. Kim, I don't know if we were prepared for this. It's kind of late in the day and just kind of laying it out heavy on us, but I definitely appreciate the answer. Folks, we're about 2 questions or so away from Q&A. We've already had a few questions come in. So those of you that might need to drop off at the 5 o'clock hour, feel free to place your questions in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as them right away. But before we do that, Dr. Kim, I did want to share with you a question that came from our educational leadership program, which is part of our Department of Educational Leadership here at GSEHD. I don't know if you know, but our educational leadership program has taken the initiative to partner with DC Public Schools and in a project that's co-funded or funded by the Wallace Foundation to produce what we're calling equity-centered leaders in the district. Principals, assistant principals, etc. And they just wanted me to shout out both the partnership and the program, and they look forward to working with you and your team in the future on that. And their question was this: how does DC Public Schools prepare current and aspiring leaders, that could be principals, that could be chancellors and deputy chancellors, to lead for equity for all, including those of color, those LGBTQIA status, those with special needs and disabilities? I see Dr. Elizabeth Kusher from our Special Education and Disabilities Department is here with us as well. And we cannot forget that disability is part of diversity as well. And the intersection of LGBTQ status and disability creates a unique frame from which some students can actually experience both their education and life. So what do we do to prepare leaders, Dr. Kim, your principals, your, I don't know if they're assistant chancellors, but those sort?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question, because in my theory of action is that everyone together in a school building works together to take care of our students, and all of us together needs to figure out how we bring a greater generosity of spirit for every one of us, and certainly problems. But at the core of that, maybe because of all the good Wallace research over the many decades, maybe because of my own experience as a building level principal, I do think principal and that role in a school is the the point of view in which all beliefs and values get translated into actions and structures and what exists in that school to enact those beliefs and values. And the principal is the person in charge of how you build that together with students and staff and so forth. And thus, leadership and preparing our leaders to be that, and supporting our leaders who are currently in that seat to strengthen that space from our belief to how we execute it is, incredibly complex. And so we, to respond back to your team member who wrote in, we went and started talking to a lot of people and say, listen, I want to recreate the promise of public education. And I do think something about the principal role and how we prepare our leadership needs to do that well. So Wallace said, hey, guess what? That makes a lot of sense. We're working on that right now. Why don't you apply to be one of the districts in this pilot? So really excited to do this work, not isolated alone, but in a community of other districts with other university partners to figure this out. And while we're doing that, we also partnered with another organization called Turn Around for Children, who is started an inaugural cohort of teachers who really also were excited. They're the first people with their hands up. They're the first 120 people in our district that said, I want more and I want this kind of learning right now, because that's going to change the way I teach and how I engage with our students. So that right there, our wonderful teaching team they're the pipeline to become my future principals and system leaders, right? So right now we just finished our first year of the group of teachers, 120 of them, who really wanted to start thinking about equity-centered teaching and learning. And they did some awesome projects with each other, with students that was a mix between some good content we provided for them and some good stuff that they were bringing to the table that they want to try out. So I think already we're building in them seeds of what different kind of leadership could be. And I certainly wasn't thinking that way as a teacher. And now with supports with GW, we're thinking about that assistant principal run. In this partnership, when we get it baked right, how do we prepare our assistant principals to put on in this particular lens of inclusive nature of things in education and affirming the human development component of this. And hopefully with strong partners like George Washington, we'll be able to better define that. And then we're also working with Howard University to think about what that does that look like for principals who are then going to become superintendents. And we're working with that particular university and that. And as you guys know, maybe you don't know, for many years before this, we've worked with Georgetown, prepare executive leaders to think about this issue at all, less so anchored in equity, but we're taking what we've learned about university partnerships and how we leverage the strengths in our city to do it this way differently, this time with George Washington Howard, specifically calling out that for us in DC Public Schools, we really want to get racial equity down, and we want to like put it on the table, and then certainly all the other identity intersections as well. But it's I don't know of many other school districts, and kind of we're far from where we are now, where we want to be. But I'm really proud of us for saying we don't hire, we don't promote, we do not create like selection criteria or promotion criteria that doesn't really push hard on our teachers and leaders like lens. And how do you respond to what's predictable and recurring in our communities, which is race and bias, and how that plays out in the life of a kid. So I think that's a long way to say I don't yet have the answers, but I think my job is to bring them, surface them, and then figure out who can help us figure it out. And that's where I think the research and practice will come and help hopefully elevate all of this and create a different pathway and a paradigm for how we tackle these questions. Because I was a teacher in DC Public Schools, and I'm kind of proud of myself for what we've been able to do. And today I get to do this thing called the Deputy Chancellor and support all the schools. But I imagine the teacher that's in the classroom today, that's going to be the Deputy Chancellor and Chancellor for DCPS 25 years from now, maybe even sooner, 20 years from now, because the care and feeding and nurturing and the what and centering on equity that they're receiving today, they're going to run circles around me on this topic 20 years from now. And that is what makes me really excited about, where this is all going to go.
No, I think the future, right? The young children, the kids, the students in DC Public Schools coming up are the heartbeat of where we can go. They're so impressive. And it sounds like there may be even more partnerships that we can do. We do executive leadership here at GSEHD as well. So we might need to talk about that as well. Folks, what we're going to do now, I know it's right at the 5 o'clock hours, we're going to go ahead and stop the recording, and we're going to shift to audience Q&A.